Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of Growth Leap. I'm your host, Michel Gagnon. We talk to pretty awesome business builders who are designing disruptive and meaningful companies. In today's episode, we go all in on sustainability and business. Our guest is Nadim Choucair. He's the founder of 2030 Cabinet, an impact-oriented ecosystem builder and partnership architect to enable sustainable innovation using the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. He's also the coordinator for the UN Global Goals Jam in Germany. We talk about how to make your startup more sustainable, running two-day design sprints to solve global challenges, moving from human-centered to life-centered design, lean approaches to measuring your startup impact, and a lot more. Enjoy the show. Nadim Choucair, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thanks so much. I'm doing well.
Nadim, you're the founder of 2030 Cabinet, a Berlin-based company that helps make its clients partnership ready for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. You're an ecosystem builder accelerating progress towards the 2030 agenda through partnerships, just to make sure that we all start at the same point and that our listeners really understand what you're working on. Can we just start by you giving us a crash course on the UN Sustainable Development Goals?
Yeah, absolutely. The UN Sustainable Development Goals are part of the Agenda 2030 from the UN, which was adopted in 2015. As the name says in it, Agenda 2030 should be achieved by 2030. So it's a 15-year agenda for basically what the UN calls sort of a bold transformation step for our world, for people, planet, and prosperity. That's the sort of three elements that they combine in it. So it actually translates into a bit of a series of 17, sustainable development goals presented with quite colorful icons so that they're actually easy to consume, perhaps, which opens it up to a few other problems, right? Greenwashing and what people say is rainbow washing in the case of the SDGs. But sticking to the point.
Never heard that one.
Yeah. It's, I don't know, people get creative, man. But sticking to the point a bit of what they are, I mean, this collection of goals can be clustered in various different ways, but it basically is a way to express a vision of what a sustainable world can be at the economic, ecological, or environmental and societal level. And you have examples like no poverty, zero hunger, gender equality. You also have issues such as reducing inequalities in general, but also looking at sustainable consumption and production, innovation and infrastructure. You also have goals that are specific to institutions and peace, such as goal number 16. And there's one goal, SDG 17, which is specifically about partnerships for the goals. So actually, in this agenda, the UN recognized that we have a series of potentially 16 goals that represent problems and challenges that we're facing in our world, and what could the world look like in 2030 if these things were fixed, and then identified one separate specific goal that is about we need partnerships to help achieve the other of the 16. And I thought that was quite interesting. It was a bit of a calling also for me, where I found where I would be able to be active, and that's why 2030 Cabinet is about partnerships for the goals as well.
I'm always curious about the inception of those ideas, startups, companies. You hold a bachelor degree in mechanical engineering, an international MBA, a master's of arts in law and diplomacy. You've worked, with the startup ecosystem in the past and many other things. What drove you to launch this specifically at that time? Because you launched that recently, right? It's a year or 2 years ago?
Yeah, it's been about a year and a half since I basically launched the brand, or I operate under the brand of 2030 Cabinet. But I started working on the SDGs around the end of 2015, so just about when they were adopted. And I learned about them during my master's at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I was taking some courses of sustainable development diplomacy, science diplomacy in the Arctic. Don't ask me why. I'm not sure that I have any Arctic roots. As you know, I did spend some time in Canada and hold the citizenship. But other than that, I think, the Arctic could be as far as anything could be from what I could find myself in or working on. But pursuing this curiosity, I learned about these topics. And it's really funny that the Arctic, or not funny, but interesting that the Arctic perhaps was my first exposure into the seriousness of the situation we're in terms of sustainable development and the melting ice cap because of global warming. But while that kind of gave a bit let's say, the urgency of the situation. When I learned about the SDGs and I found them to be a practical way of communicating what could be a vision for a better world, I got super interested in seeing how can we, or basically I was starting to wanting to match my previous interest, which was, as you said, startup ecosystems, innovation ecosystems, looking at entrepreneurship policy and innovation policy. And the question I always had in my career prior to going to Fletcher was, how can we enable innovation, and how can public policy and the private sector together work to enable innovation? Then my kind of question turned into, how can we enable innovation for the SDGs? And so during my master's, I wrote, or during my studies at Fletcher, I wrote my capstone project about integrating the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda to a design thinking framework, sort of wanting to develop a sustainable design thinking approach. And I thought this would be an interesting way to speak the language that businesses are so much in need or looking at, which is design thinking, innovation, etc. It stayed as a bit of a thesis or a capstone and a side interest. And while I worked for 2 years here in Berlin, right after I wrote my thesis and graduated, I worked at Venture, which is now a company part of EY, as an ecosystem manager and just managing a few projects on innovation scouting, etc. I kept working on the SDGs on the side, but eventually decided in 2019, perhaps it's time to just turn that attention into a full-time gig and see what I can do with it. Having grown the network, having understood the importance of this, but also having found that, maybe I'm onto something in terms of what is interesting for me and how I can contribute, and to give myself a bit of the openness to really explore that further.
One of the things I really want to cover, one of the themes in this interview, is really what you just said, right? That how do you actually make businesses more sustainable? How do you actually bring partners, maybe new frameworks or ways of thinking, so that we innovate and at the same time we tackle those huge challenges? And, we'll probably get there by taking a few turns. But one thing I want to talk about that's very recent is that you're also the coordinator of the UN Global Goals Jam in Germany. And it's an event that happens every year. The last edition happened last September. And I think it's a good segue into that theme I want to cover. What's the jam about, and what happens there? Who participates in those jams?
The jam is it's an event that was created and initiated by the Digital Society School in Amsterdam with support from the UNDP. Throughout the years, it started, I think, in 15 cities, and 2019 was the biggest, obviously, because 2020 was really with the COVID times, but 2019 was the biggest with 95 cities participating. So back in 2018, I decided to organize the local Berlin event, right? So I teamed up with two of my friends. So we started this up here, Claudia and Katharina. And we started this with the support from SDG Investments, who trusted us and supported us with sponsorship for the first one. And basically what it was about is it's 2.5 days. So starting on Friday evening and ending on, let's say, Sunday evening. And during those 2.5 days, we bring together participants from various disciplines, developers, designers, business people, sustainability experts, and professionals, etc. And what they do is they work on a challenge that is given to them on Friday that is related to one or more than one of the SDGs. And they go through basically a bit of a design sprint format to come up with solutions and prototypes by Sunday evening. So it's really compacted in these 2 days. And that's why it's called a jam. That's why it's called the Global Goals Jam, because really we try to solve challenges related to the SDGs and come up with innovative ideas.
Can you give us an example of what a challenge would be?
Absolutely. One challenge was, for example, about how might we convince residents in Berlin to be more attentive to the electronic waste they generate and then help them recycle, for example, their electronic waste, right? So this is kind of how the challenge morphed into, but it started off with a very broad aspect of sustainable consumption production and the problem of overconsumption of electronics. That's one example. I mean, other examples are how might we reduce food waste and convince companies that this is something they should be working on. We also worked on challenges. This last year, we had amazing topics. And one of the topics we looked at was how can we help people understand the interrelation between mental health and climate change, which actually opened up a new angle on this, or not necessarily a new angle, but two complementary angles. One is the effect of obviously climate change on mental health, and this being always bombarded with these let's say news or the dangers of climate change, the issue of climate activism and its impact on the mental health of people always trying to be active and fighting for the cause, but also interestingly the fact that mental health or the lack thereof in some way is perhaps detrimental to climate change because it's related to our patterns of overconsuming. So this was a very interesting challenge, to be honest.
I'm really interested in what you've learned over those 3 years and what is maybe the most valuable outcome of that event. Because, you're basically, if I'm correct, you're bringing people who don't necessarily know each other and you ask them, you have 2 days and a half to solve some of the toughest challenges in the world. What is the real or the best outcome that you've seen over those 3 years?
A big element of the Jam, even on a global level, how it was designed by the Digital Society School, is about trying to tap into the local network and building bridges and partnerships with people from the local network. And when I say people, it's really people from all types of stakeholders from the ecosystem. So, civil society, corporates, innovators, funders, so investors, public sector, stuff like that. So throughout the years, we started on the first year just basically with a minimal Jam saying, look, we're not looking for sponsorships more or less in terms of the people who provide us with challenges. We're trying to see how the Jam can help, people who are already working perhaps on a few projects. So we tried to reach out to a few startups. They came in with the challenges that they had, and the teams worked with them on sort of some of the challenges that they were working on. We found that to be useful in that some of the startups actually found that super beneficial for the 2 days, and they continued working with some of the people that were with them in the team. So we thought that was great because we helped some startups that are working on challenges related to the SDGs. And whatever happened organically after was great. We couldn't control it and we didn't have the resources. The second year in 2019, we actually tried to look at more of the Jam potentially as a service or as something that can help larger organizations with challenges they're facing. So we had a challenge provided by corporate, a challenge provided by a part of the city of Berlin, Berlin Convention Office, and yada yada, some other types of challenges and other stakeholders. But for that, there was a clear challenge owner in that, these entities who also supported Jam financially set a challenge that the team and the participants can work on, which was made under the impression that once we have a challenge owner, there's vested interest in seeing what could this lead to, right? And meaning what could, there's someone who would have a structure to perhaps take the results coming out of the Jam and turn them to something useful, because as we said before, it's only a spark. Now, funny enough, that year there was also one team for whom we didn't find any sponsors and challenge owners. So I did, along with Katarina and Claudia, we sort of mapped out how things should be for that Jam and brought all these partners and participants together. But for this team, there was the idea to have a bit of an open challenge, which came from research related to the World Economic Forum report on electronic waste. Fast forward 1 year after the Jam, that team that worked on this open challenge that nobody owned, or no entity owned, actually was pitching at a demo day by the Bosch Startup Harbor program, which is from the Berlin Startup Stipendium. So they actually got into an accelerator, they formed a team after, they pursued the idea, and they received funding, and they were pitching at a demo day of the Bosch Startup Harbor Accelerator. And that made us rethink a bit that also this giving the team the ability to take ownership of the challenge in a way they want to shape it together could be powerful, right? It was one example. I don't think we have enough of a sample, so we're still experimenting. And it also showed us that on the other end, it's great that some organizations can support the Jam and basically put forward a challenge that they think is interesting. But I think also what we learned is that the level of commitment to really reach something where there are tangible results that could be out of it requires much more work from us in terms of how we prepare all of this, but also much more commitment from, let's say, these challenge partners.
IDEO published an article entitled Capitalism Needs a Redesign, but where do we start? And that brings me a bit to the role of companies and startups. You mentioned just earlier that partners, and I'm assuming many of them are corporations, need to be committed, not just for the event, but afterwards. One of the things I've discussed frequently on the podcast is, are we setting ourselves up for failure when you look at the system that we have at the moment, right? Where people, companies are either measured or celebrated by company share prices, their growth in users and revenues. What are the, maybe the quick wins that we need to go after in the short term so that businesses, startups, VCs, the world starts to understand that this makes sense and it's actually also reachable?
I wrote an article called Sustainability by Design or Designing for Sustainability and the difference between those things. And what I meant to do with this small play on word is it matters what challenge you're starting off from. So when you are trying to make things a bit more sustainable for various reasons, in many cases being demand driven, that's sort of like now being mentioned a lot. So demand driven transformation, because consumers and lawmakers are demanding that you change and become more sustainable. And in Sustainability by Design, I found that the SDGs offer an interesting one out of many potential frameworks where we can use them to frame our challenges and innovation challenges. And look at that from a perspective is, how might we actually improve situations related to hunger, poverty, inequality, etc.? And then from there, see what is it that we as an organization, company, startup, etc., can leverage if this becomes our mission. I also call this sort of the move beyond human-centered design into a different type of design, which I've heard now many people call it life-centered design, such as famous designer called Bruce Mao, but also I think even Design It or Fjord, I'm not sure, as a design company sort of are now using that type of language, which is meaning we're moving away from the Anthropocene, from the looking at what human specific needs are, but also looking at design in a more holistic manner, which is about preserving or improving life on this planet for humans and others, while definitely understanding that the ecosystem that we live within. And again, here, I think the SDGs are an interesting framework. 17 representations of images of what the world can be in 2030, zero hunger, no poverty, and a bunch of ways we can translate that into what is it that we can do at the core to be able to meet those. And I think this is where it could be a start, where we're shifting our innovation efforts towards orienting ourselves for more sustainable businesses or more sustainable policies, more sustainable whatever it is that you want to be. But waiting until this is only demand driven and even policy driven is still along the same lines of this capitalistic approach, which is that it's only determined by what where the consumers put their money. And I don't want to negate the power of that as it is in the current system, but I don't think it's served us for that specific purpose very well in the past.
Let's say we zoom in more on startups and scale-ups, which is the bulk of our listeners. There is a trend that I don't necessarily like, and I guess we have to go through this at the moment because that's the way change happens. But where you have startups and then you have impact startups. I personally don't like that we have this separation. I think any startup or company should think about its impact, how they're maybe creating a negative impact in the world and how they can mitigate that, but also go beyond just minimizing your destruction of the world by operating a business, but go beyond and say, how do I actually contribute? And I understand, I'm managing a business myself. It's challenging because there's so many things, so many balls in the air. But if you have an advice for startups, who are hitting the growth stage, and they want to make an impact, what kind of framework or what kind of tool or ideas or advice do you have for them to say, look, I know you're busy, especially right now in the middle of a pandemic. You want to keep things afloat, but if you want to increase your impact, here's a simple way to get started.
To keep it boring, I'll bring it back to the SDGs. And one of the concrete examples to do it this way is in my workshops, whether it's for corporates, accelerator programs that offer to their own startups or to startups. I start off by asking people to figure out how they contextually relate to the SDGs, but also what is the impact of their own work, solution, startup, right, on the Sustainable Development Goals. And in an iterative process, we get to a point where we select the 3 important SDGs that they're contributing to. But the SDGs are an interconnected system of 17 goals and 169 targets. So when, let's say you're in education, right? And what you want to do is, perhaps pre-COVID times, is you want to build a school in some remote area. But your school does not have access, or the remote area where you're trying to build a school does not have access to clean water and sanitation. Well, first of all, then good luck building your school. But second of all, perhaps the system that you want to be working in is more around providing clean water and sanitation to this area. Now, obviously, if you're someone who's more on the education front, this is your expertise, then you need to find partners who can help work on that problem before you can start working on the education issue alone. So this is one way, for example, not necessarily of looking into unintended and negative consequences, but also unintended dependencies, or not, you can't say unintended, but dependencies on the system in which you are operating. And this is, I think, where, again, it's very hard for me to call it advice, but I just tend to think, like, can we think of what role we want to play specifically within the system, and then understand where should we put our weight behind which initiative, where do we have the most leverage, so that we can actually, get to that end result of, okay, making this more sustainable.
To go back to what I was just saying about, what I frequently see is you're either an impact startup or you're a startup. Is this realistic? I mean, when you're an impact company or startup, it's, your goal is really to tackle one of those challenges, right? That's the purpose, or your raison d'être, right? This is why you exist. You really want to tackle that. Most companies launch a startup because they like entrepreneurship, because they want to build something. Some of them because they think that they can make it and going to get rich. But sometimes the drive or the purpose behind that, it is a bit different. And launching a company, keeping that company running, is in itself is a challenge, right? So is this realistic for startups who are not necessarily impact startup or SDG focused startups? Is it realistic to think that they can do it by themselves? Should we try to look for more partnerships to help them? Or is this more a question of the next generation of entrepreneurs and startup leaders, we just train them the wrong way?
Very good point. And the last thing you mentioned, is, training the wrong way. I think this takes me back to what I first said about, or when you talked about a bit of my background as an ecosystem builder. My whole interest into things, it was in Montreal, where I know that you were also based, and we have a common network. It was in Montreal that I was working on sort of at the intersection of public and private sector, let's say, initiatives to help promote innovation and enable innovation. And it quickly became clear to me or I did some research to also understand more about it, that the need for an entrepreneurial ecosystem and what different types of stakeholders should be there to support new founders, new entrepreneurs innovate. And 10 years ago, this was all the talk was about, what ecosystem do we need in place to produce more unicorns? Scale that down a bit. What could we do to help more people exit and create, of course, yes, more wealth, not necessarily more wealthy individuals, but more wealth in terms of more capital being injected into the startups and people having an experience founding several startups, and that sort of will trickle down and the ecosystem will get more mature. It's not so different. This whole ecosystem approach that is needed is there. It's just there's one very, very critical element. The incentive is extremely different. So a lot of the incentive or perhaps even the potential return on all of the risks that so many people within the ecosystems are taking when you speak of a let's say, a tech-oriented, growth-oriented startup ecosystem, there's a lot of it there that kind of fits almost everybody's needs at the way capitalism is structured. More jobs, politicians are happy. More tax money coming in. More return on investment for the VCs. So yes, 9 will fail, 1 will go, I don't know, 12x, and that's great. People become richer. Obviously, more types of solutions and tools in the hands of people, from apps to new fashion to whatever you want to call it. So like a lot of people are just happy and they're over consuming, but they think they're happy. But no, I mean, to be less cynical, there's a lot of value being created, but it's the way that value is being approached with this expectation of 10 multiples of the original investment, specifically from the VC world, is just not applicable in an impact or an impact by design type of startup. So again, it brings me back. The ecosystem is the same, but the incentive is different. It needs an understanding, first of all, that a lot of these problems that are being solved, first of all, it might take much longer to create a systems change. Second is that it needs a long-termist approach. So you can't expect that in case it is for profit, you can't expect that an exit would happen about, 7-8 years with a multiple. It's going to take much longer to really change things that are related to such deep challenges. And third, the government should also, and I think in some ways they do understand, but in others it's really hard to implement, that solving these challenges on a much longer horizon is actually extremely beneficial for them as a government, because it's going to be much less costs on rebuilding, reskilling, dealing with crises, the motivations, but also, I guess, the readiness of different ecosystem actors to expect less short-termist results is what needs to change. So that's why I think there are, in what you said at the end, did we teach them the wrong way? I think the general expectations of the ecosystem is just needing to shift. And that's, I think, what's happening. And that's why the impact startups that start by saying, I am here to I'm an impact startup, there's an acknowledgement of the depth of the challenges that they could be facing, perhaps the long-termist approach that they want to take, and obviously the need for different types of partners that they need to engage with.
I just want to pick on that because one of the things that startups and companies do a lot is tracking a certain set of metrics. When you're a startup, you hear about the pirate metrics, these kind of things. How, what's your funnel? What does your funnel look like? What's your conversion rate at each step? One of the challenges when you think about the SDGs, when you think about sustainability in general or impact, is how do you actually measure that impact, right? And I remember many years ago, one way that corporations measured impacts was by saying, well, we spent $1 million this year in sponsorships and donations. We're good corporate citizens. Please leave us alone. And that's obviously a number that's easy to get, right? Because you're writing the checks. What is more difficult is measuring that impact. And I remember back in the days, I've worked on this myself with, a multinational, and there were a lot of people involved. So my question is for smaller companies, and keeping in mind maybe the SDGs as the framework to use, is there not necessarily an easy, but a simple or simpler way for these, new startups and scale-ups to actually measure their impact without having to hire an army of consultants?
There are lean or leaner approaches to sort of measuring impact and determining basically what is called in the industry the theory of change, right, of a specific startup. But the challenges that impact startups face are also similar to, normal startups, scale-ups, in that there's a propensity to perhaps wanting to look at some vanity metrics, like yes, conversion rate, but what does that mean in terms of the actual, obviously impact on the bottom line, perhaps in a startup, but in terms of, what is our product or what is our service specifically trying to do? So I'll just take an example of something that's not necessarily an impact startup, but all these productivity tools out there. So they might measure impact, obviously, in like how many subscriptions and the bottom line. But at the end of the day, actually, the impact is, how many people did you help be more productive? And perhaps, I think, if the founder was idealistic, they started with this vision that my tool is going to help so many people be more productive, and that's going to save so much money on everybody. Their employers and their own time is going to be better, and they're going to feel better about themselves and everything. So impact startups face the same issue, because what tends to happen in some cases is that instead of focusing on the outright impact, they might focus a bit on the outcome that they're trying to produce. And this is where they get lost into vanity metrics. I've found a way to be quite interesting, iterative, and sort of easy to do, is to help people actually, again, and I keep coming back to it, using the SDGs as a proxy to help people shape their theory of change. So starting off by understanding what are the sustainable development goals that you might have an impact on, understanding that the SDGs are all interconnected as a system, and then using that to get basically to your own system, the own system from within which you operate. And when you start mapping these connections of the goals themselves, then you move one level deeper into the targets. So there are 17 goals, 169 targets. Then you have a level of granularity in terms of, you can use the targets. In most of the cases, you can use them very effectively to sort of describe or qualify this relationship that you mapped. So now that you understand the system that the challenge that you have sits within, you have tools with the SDGs to look at specific targets that you might want to consider that could be important for you to pay attention to, in terms of the education, in terms of the good health and well-being of the community, in terms of the economic situation of the community, etc. And now that you have that, for the targets really related to your own map, instead of looking at the 169 targets, you kind of, brought it down to a level that's easier for you to consume. Well, guess what? There are indicators that are already associated with most of the SDGs. So that kind of allows you to build a bit of a first hypothetical impact framework and measurement framework. And yes, it is my expertise, so I can take startups through this in one day. But if they use the SDGs and dig deeper into them, they can sort of, the framework is there. It's just about connecting the dots and going through them.
I don't want to take too much of your time, Nadim, but I'd like to know what's coming up in your plans for 2030 cabinets in the next 6 to 12 months.
2030 cabinet, I set it up with a bit of a larger vision. The idea there is to help accelerate progress towards the 2030 agenda through partnerships. And I do this in 3 pillars, or cycle of 3 steps, call it. So one is learn to become partnership ready. And this is where I do trainings and workshops to all types of organizations, startups, corporates, incubators, accelerators, university, public sector as well. Step number 2 of this is when you learn to become partnership ready, or basically we have a level of common understanding of what the SDGs are because we want to partner for them, is to help connect people to the right partners. And this is one very specific stream I'll be working on for the next year, is to consolidate this and make more accessible, more concrete this knowledge of the ecosystem that I have in what could be a digital approach to it, to have an understanding of who are the stakeholders that can help achieve some of the SDGs and what role do they play in helping achieve some of the SDGs. So that's one project we're looking at concretely. And obviously the jam will still be there.
Yes, hopefully in a non-COVID environment.
Absolutely. So we hope it will be an in-person event as well. And this is the third part actually of 2030 Cabinet, which is, learn, connect, and engage with the local community. And next year we want, I'm coordinating in Germany. There are 6 city teams and city leads doing, amazing jobs in each of these cities. I also am sort of leading the Berlin Jam. So I can only talk about specifically what we think we want to do with the Jam next year. We're building this community, which is now 3 years of alumni and participants and coaches, amazing coaches that are just design thinking experts and systems thinking experts that help us are coming back every year, which is really cool to see. And we just want to grow this community. So for next year, what we're trying to think of is who are the different players that we need to bring into that, let's say, platform that we're calling the Global Goals Jam, and having them interact with this community. And how can we, move it maybe from being just a community of these now, let's say 70 individuals that participated, to having corporates and other types of organizations, institutions involved, and what would it take to get them involved at a level of commitment that makes sense for them, but also for the community and the effort that we're putting in. But the jam will happen September, I think it's next year's 20th. So I think 19, 20, 21, if I'm not mistaken. It's that weekend every year. I'm personally working on a few projects, European Commission funded projects on sustainable agriculture. And I'm looking at a specific niche in terms of sustainable food systems, and with a lot of interest in that topic. So there'll be more coming around that topic, I hope, next year, and seeing how we can reshape our food systems in something that is more sustainable. So that is also on the horizon next year. But it all comes down to one specific thing. Your podcast is about growth leap, and it's that leap that I'm thinking I need to take to be able to grow the influence of whatever I'm trying to do. So I think on a non-topical level, but more operational level, for me, the plan is to, get more collaborators on board that are fully committed to that project so we can work together.
Thanks so much, Nadim, for your time. Thanks for your insights. It was very exciting. Wish you all the best, and hopefully we'll have an in-person beer very soon.
Thanks so much, Michel.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast, and as usual, you can find the show notes at stunena.com. Also, if you want to accelerate your startup growth and build something meaningful, well, check out our Growth Lead for Tech Startups online course at growth.stunena.com. Thanks a lot.